Welcome to the Feed Central Hay Matters podcast, your go-to source for all things hay-related in Australia. I'm your host, Jon Paul Driver. In today's episode, we have Rob Lawson with Balco on. We're also joined by Tim Ford, who's going to do the introduction for Rob. I'll let you take it away, Tim.
Thanks, Jon Paul, and welcome to the podcast, Rob.
Thanks, Tim.
Great pleasure to have you here today, and as always, wonderful hospitality in South Australia and wonderful hospitality at Balco as always. So Balco is a very significant player in the export market in Australia. Long history. We have a separate podcast with one of the founders, Malcolm May, which will be playing over the next few weeks. Rob's the current Chief Executive Officer of Balco and steering the ship of a large and successful hay export industry and a very significant player in the balaclava and district community. So welcome, Rob.
Rob, welcome to the podcast. So you and I had the occasion to speak at an industry event back in August, just before the AFIA conference.
Yeah, exactly. Good to catch up. Yeah, nice to make acquaintance again, JP, for sure.
Can you talk about the basics of the Australian export industry, and then we'll dive a little deeper into the current market conditions. Maybe we can talk a little bit US and a little bit Australia and how those things play back and forth.
Yeah, look, for the Australian export industry, like it's relatively small compared to the total amount of hay that's grown in the country as a whole. You know, we operate around the 1.2 million tonnes of hay and straw goes for export every year. At a different point to certainly a lot of our export markets confuse oat hay with alfalfa hay and the difference that they both fit in the market, especially in the developing markets. That in a new market, that's a different point. And a lot of things that people don't realise is that oat hay or cereal hay is one cut, and everything in Australia that goes for export, when I say everything, let's say 99% of what goes from Australia is dryland farming. There's occasional small bits of some oats or some cereal hay that may be irrigated for export, but 99% predominantly is dryland farming. So it's planting in between the end of April and maybe the first week of June, so through that period, and then harvest is occurring last week of September through to the kind of, middle of November is pretty much the period. And it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about the three main hay growing states in Australia are Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia, and all of them run that same cycle of planting and harvest for hay. Yeah. And
nearly all of the exports are oaten hay or some variation of cereal hay.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say, again, probably 99% is oat hay. 99% is oat hay. There is a little bit of wheat hay, a little bit of barley hay, but predominantly absolutely oat hay, yeah.
And the desirable characteristic is the sugar content and the structural fiber, and that gets used in livestock rations in Japan and Korea and China and several other developing countries, right?
Absolutely. Probably the two key factors are absolutely is water-soluble carbohydrate and non-detergent fibre, NDF, yeah. And they're the key players, and really oat hay is not fed for protein. We're going to range between 5 and 10% protein, and 10 is absolutely at the top end. We probably range more between 5 and 8.5% protein, something like that.
Now, the logistics behind the industry, stop me if I get this wrong. The hay's baled in the paddock, shipped into the press facility. The volume is reduced to increase the density of the bale, and then put in a shipping container and exported. Is there much more than that?
That's exactly it. There's a little bit more than that. Like, we pride ourselves on, certainly in Australia, because it's dryland farming, if somebody's got a relationship with an exporter, and certainly here at Balco, but I think most exporters follow a similar process, but certainly at Balco, we inspect the paddock straight after seeding time to make sure there's not contamination in that field. And if our field managers see an issue, they work with the grower to remove that potential contamination, whether it be, a fallen tree branch or an animal carcass or a large amount of stones or something. We try to work with the grower to rectify that. So after seeding, but before germination. So we try to visit that that paddock or at early germination, right in that very early stage to see that the field's clear. And then we'll pay another visit to the field that's dedicated to us probably around in July, which is right in the middle of the growing. And at that point, our field managers are looking for any weed contamination or anything that might be in the paddock. And we'll certainly work with the grower to treat that if it's required. But I must say most of our farmers who are long-term hay growers manage that extremely well. And then the next time we see one of our guys is right around when they begin baling. So, and we go through and we run a process where we core test 20% of all of the bales in a field, and then we mix a sample, and from that we get a feed test representative of that whole field for what's the quality of the hay. But more than that, we also are testing for annual ryegrass toxicity, or ARGT as it's known. And hay is a prescribed product for export. Really what sets it apart for that is that ARGT testing, and that we must be ARGT negative for it to be able to be exported in the first place.
So lots of quality control is what you just said, and starting from the very earliest point.
Yeah, as early as possible. I'd say, predominantly the difference in the three states in Australia is South Australia, largely, if somebody's growing hay, they're going to have a relationship with an exporter, and they generally have it prior to seeding. And it's probably true in Victoria and Western Australia, but maybe even more so in South Australia, because there's not a significant domestic market in South Australia. Victoria is pretty close to Australia's largest dairy region, so there is a domestic market in Victoria as well as the export. And in Western Australia, it's probably fair to say that there's a group of farmers who will grow a dual purpose oat, something that will lend itself to being a hay crop, or if the season dictates, or if the oat grain price is high enough, that maybe they'll alternate between whether they're going to harvest that crop or cut it for hay. So there's kind of a small difference in each state. But for us at Balco particularly, we predominantly try to have our hectares all contracted prior to or right at seeding time. And so then we have a good gauge to know that we've got enough hay coming in to manage for our season ahead.
Without getting into any specifics around those contracts, those are volume contracts without any price specified?
They're pretty much a hectare-based contract.
Ah, okay.
So not so much a volume. The hay contracts work a little bit differently to what people might be familiar with on a grain contract, is that we have a hectare-based contract. Occasionally we cover ourselves on the top side. So, if the yields are really high, because the worst thing that anybody can do is make hay and not be able to put it under cover. So we are making sure that, we might cover it on the top side. So if an average yield is, this is very generally speaking, but if an average yield is 5.5 tonne to the hectare, or 5 tonne to the hectare across the states, which pretty much across the growing regions is close to that, we might cover ourselves up to, we'll take whatever's out of that field up to 8 or 9 tonnes to the hectare.
Oh, okay.
But if it happened to have a 10 or 11 tonne looking like it's going to be a big yielding crop, the farmers will know then that we can take up to whatever that cap is, and then they make a choice of whether they might let some of that paddock go through and harvest it for grain, or keep some additional tonnage for domestic market sales. But in the event of a drought, of low rainfall conditions, there's no penalty to the grower. We just ask them to deliver the area that they've contracted to us. So if that yield gets as low as 3 tonne to the hectare, there's no penalty to any grower. They just deliver what came off of those hectares, and we're flexible with them on that. So, yeah. Let's
dive into some export market conditions. And do you mind if I start with my perceptions and then you can kind of respond? I'm given to understand you're just back from the States visiting El Centro and Ellensburg, the kind of the hay capitals of the U.S. And the story here has been higher interest rates driving an exceptionally strong dollar, which actually hinders the exports from the U.S. and favors Australian exports.
That's a good thing, JP.
Well, I mean, it depends on which side of the ocean you're on.
Yeah, very true.
It's pretty tough times here right now in the hay industry.
Yeah, on the currency, like we like it when it's trading where it is. It's kind of mid-60s Australian dollar against the US. I genuinely believe probably a fair currency is something closer to 75. Where everybody works in there's a space where it can work for everybody when it operates in that. But with that, the market has a lot of. Don't worry, all of our export customers, and it doesn't matter which country, they all track US dollar exchange rate very closely, and the price does fluctuate depending on where that trades at.
Well, I could tell you that in 2021 we had a terrible drought, and we went into our 2022 season with exceptionally high prices. Our exporters were exceptionally competitive, going out and buying a lot of inventory and writing price and volume contracts. Like they were buying this stack of hay, and then the dollar strengthened. And that hay, there's still 2022 hay inventory sitting around here that's, it's probably coming to the end of its exportable life, and the nature of the relationships between the growers and exporters is tough. It's a tough situation here, but again, that favors Australian exports, and I'll let you take it from there.
Well, it really is, and we watched what happened last year in that 2023, last half of 2023, in the export markets, which was, we saw, export prices, particularly alfalfa, change dramatically. And not only was there hay left in the US, but I visited, Korea, Japan and China multiple times last year, and particularly more so in China, maybe in the other countries, but we saw hay of many brands sitting in warehouses where wholesalers had purchased hay. The price had crashed, had dropped. And so, there was wholesalers in China who were holding product, hoping that the price would return before they sell it so they don't crystallise their loss. And so, the whole market, and absolutely I understand for the American grower and particularly for the American exporter who'd taken a position on hay, almost unprecedented times and really challenging. Yeah, really challenging.
How does that play out for the grower in Australia?
I think for the grower in Australia, we had a period where there was some issues during the COVID period where factory registrations into China, where there was, 23 out of 26 registered establishments in Australia, their factory renewal came up at the same point in time. They didn't get renewed immediately in China. There was a period of maybe around 18 months to 2 years where those factory renewals were waiting, and it was due to, just a delay through the COVID period and whatever had happened there, but there was a hold up, they weren't renewed. And so the Australian market kind of lost some space that they'd got comfortable with and got used to as a whole. And then there was some work done to develop some newer markets. And then in October last year, the access to the China market was restored to all of the registered establishments in Australia. And so that's it's worked really well for the Australian export market, because we also, in the previous year, 2022 harvest, particularly in South Australia and Victoria, a huge amount of rain all through harvest, a lot of damaged hay, some hay that didn't even make it into a bale. It was so severely damaged, had 6 inches or 150 millimetres of rain on it in some cases. So we were the market was really in recovery phase, but fortunately, in October, November 23, we had quite good haymaking weather in every state. So we've got a range of mid to high grade hays probably through Australia right now, and then coinciding that with the restoration of the China market has set things up to be a relatively good space for the Australian export market. Couple that with a mid-60s dollar. It's put the Australian market into a decent spot. I would say the rider to that, I think the dairy industry globally is under pressure right at the moment. And so whilst the demand is there, the ability to pay really high prices it's non-existent at the moment. So I think there's a rationalisation happening in the dairy industry. Cow numbers are settling in many of the export countries, changing, as in reducing when I say changing. And I think we're kind of waiting for that to level out and see what happens. And my guess is purely my own opinion, but my guess is it'll take most of 2024 for that to settle. And I think as we enter into 2025, then we'll know what the new normal will look like.
I'm watching our exporters. I like the term crystallized losses. I would say realized losses. I'm watching our exporters realize their losses on those positions that they took in hay. There's also traders in Japan and South Korea and China across the board that are also in the process of realizing those losses. Is that correct?
Absolutely they are. Absolutely they are.
And that makes it that doesn't make it a great place for you to sell into, even if you have a favorable exchange rate and high quality product.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And look, you are 100% right. You talk about realising I guess just back to that play on words, JP, on the crystallise is, I think, because we've all been in that spot where you take a position on something, you know that it's there, and so you realise that it's there, but actually the day you sell it is when it becomes, you crystallise, my term, you crystallise it becomes rock solid.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But yeah, everything you just said is absolutely correct. Like that may, and so there's people are wary everywhere, I think, in the market, because there aren't, because equally, as I was saying, the dairy farmers facing uncertainty as well as things are settling. And
that dairy comment is ubiquitous, whether it's the States. Australia is going okay on their milk price. Canada doesn't count because of their quota system. But then you get to Asia, their dairies, and especially China and Japan, are not profitable. They're going through that right-sizing process.
They definitely are. Yep, absolutely. Part of that is them then really putting extra effort in getting their rations right, so that they are producing, a quality milk at the least cost price that they can.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, there's a little bit of interplay between the Northwest Timothy world that I live in and the Australian oaten hay. I'm seeing, now this is leading into what do you think for the future, for the next year, as your growers are just starting to make planting decisions. As I'm looking at our Timothy market, there's not a lot of excitement to maintain Timothy stands in our neck of the woods. They can rotate out to dry edible beans or silage corn, or there's lots of different and naturally into potatoes. There's lots of different options in our market, and to look at 2 years worth of hay inventory and to come back to Timothy is just plain unappetizing. I think there's probably, we're right-sizing, and I think we're probably going to overcorrect and not produce quite enough Timothy. I think that helps the whole market clear.
Definitely, Australian, absolutely what you're saying is right. So oat hay does compete for a similar space in the ration as Timothy or Sudan. Really, they're both fed for fibre predominantly. Certainly from the States, only in the last couple of weeks, seem to be a very large push of Sudan is down. Plantings of Sudan are going to be down. I guess the take, and it was a very small sample size. I probably visited 8 exporters, I guess, 8 or 9, but no one really spoke about Timothy hectares being reduced. A lot of them thought that would be similar, of the guys that I spoke about, but everybody was talking about alfalfa hectares going up, and that was largely around, because that can fit a space in the domestic market as well as the export market pretty comfortably. As far as in Australia, we're seeing fairly consistently, the early feedback for us is, I think, plantings of oat hay in Australia will be consistent. I don't think we're going to see any reduction. There might be a slight increase, but it's going to be fairly well travelling as normal. That's what we're getting back from our growers. If anything, slightly increased, but not. I'm not talking about a big push upwards. I'm saying, maintaining the status quo with a slight increase.
The price implication there is, assuming there's no change in exchange rates, it's been relatively stable at that mid-60s. The exchange rate between the US dollar and Japanese yen, for example, has been stable, but at a terrible rate for exports. That seems to suggest stability in demand for Australian producers. Is that?
That's what we're hoping. Yeah, definitely. That's what we're suggesting. And a couple of our Japan-based customers are feeling as though the yen may strengthen a bit against the US dollar, in the next couple of months. If that happens, that should help their affordability a little bit as well. So
some cautious optimism in the Australian oat and hay space.
That would be very fair to say. Yeah, that would be where I'm sitting. If I was more confident about the global dairy space, you would probably hear
some optimism,
right? Some straight out optimism. But because of not really knowing where that dairy space will settle, absolutely, it's cautious optimism, like wanting to feel good about it, but not wanting to let myself or let ourselves do that just yet, because there is still those unknowns. And of course, when you're talking about dryland farming, everything's always open to what are the weather conditions. That's exactly right. What's the weather conditions going to do?
It's either up or it's down. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I play in the dryland Timothy space, so
yeah,
I'm well aware of what a zero yield looks like, and followed the next year by a 5-10 to the acre, maybe one of those 10. Oh, let's see here. That'd be one of those 10 or 11 ton to the hectare crops.
Hectare crops, yeah.
Yeah. From 0 to 10 from one year to the next. I'm familiar with the concept.
Fully understand, yeah.
Oat and hay in relation to other crops. How's that balance look?
So typically for us, everyone's different. Everyone does something slightly different. But as a general rule, I normally explain that our farmers would probably put around 20% of their farm into, if they're a regular hay grower, it's probably around 20% of their farm will be in hay. And typically in Australia, they are growing, wheat, barley, canola, and then they'll have a legume of some kind, whether it's peas, beans, or lentils. Particularly South Australia and Victoria, they grow lentils. The soil type doesn't really lend itself to grow lentils in Western Australia so much. But often in Western Australia, they'll be growing lupins, in that crop. And so for us, it's really important that we provide a hay price to a grower that is relative to the return they might be getting on wheat, for example, a gross margin per hectare kind of return. And so we're always very aware of not only what's happening in the export market, but then also what are the, what happens for a grower, because I certainly openly talk to our customers about we need to make sure that oat hay is competitive with the other returns for the growers, because there's got to be an incentive for the grower to keeping that in their rotation. I think it's probably true to say there's some agronomic benefits to growing hay, but that can't be it on its own. There's got to be a return to the pocket as well. There just has to be, and it's got to stand up against the other commodities. That is something that we are constantly looking at and working through. And the other thing that I'm a massive believer in is that in every supply chain, everybody has to be able to make a dollar who plays an important role in that supply chain. And as soon as someone in that supply chain makes a disproportionate profit, you're setting up for that supply chain to break, because people will just give up. They'll know that someone's making a disproportionate profit, and that'll bring about the reason that it'll fail. And that's whether it happens to be a farmer, a transport operator, an exporter, or a customer at the other end. Everybody has to be able to make a reasonable profit on the way through, and then that's how supply chains last for a long time.
I like that. There's a theme of stability in there.
Absolutely, there is. And sure, there's times where somebody will, for a season, might have a better year than the last year, and all of those things. That's all part of that cyclical mix. But if someone for a sustained period is making a disproportionate profit, you guarantee that within a year or two, that supply chain won't be there.
Yeah, Absolutely.
We are starting to see, like, shipping rates are probably coming back to normal. We certainly, and I think that wasn't just exclusive to Australia, but, shipping rates during COVID hit some crazy levels, and challenges to get containers and do all of those things. And we are seeing, it started to happen during the last half of 2023, and it's probably still continuing now, where shipping rates, they're not back yet to pre-COVID levels, but they're heading back into a much more settled environment, which probably, it's also a reason for that quiet confidence from my end, that cautious optimism, because obviously that's a contributing factor as well to see those shipping rates, coming back into more pre-COVID levels. Then, as I said, I stress they're not at pre-COVID levels. They're still higher, but they're heading in that direction. So,
some different market characteristics on shipping containers than I'm used to.
I would say that is very real. Yes.
You mean you can't get containers to go to Guangzhou for $500 right now? Ours are coming. So we came down and crashed, and then we've come back up slightly.
So you're rising back up a little bit. Yeah. We're probably still, from Australia, we're probably still, coming down a bit. Like I joke with people and say, the problem for us in Australia is that we're not on the way to anywhere.
Right.
Like
right.
It's a very specific. If somebody's doing a call here, we're talking about a population of 26 million people, 25 million people, very, very export focused. Our shipping, and we're really not on the way to anywhere. So it's very purpose filled. So I think we, when the tail's wagging on pricing of shipping, we probably might be the last to see the benefits at times.
One last question on interest rates. I don't follow the RBA maybe as close as I should. I do follow our Federal Reserve, and they're talking about leaving our interest rates stable for now. What's the RBA looking like?
The most recent meeting, there was no change. It's probably the commentators are a little bit mixed, but I think we're probably at the level where I'm hearing some commentary that's saying we might see, just 0.25% or something. Either way, but some guys are saying it may go up, some guys are saying it may come down. But again, the general commentary is that if we get through to the end of 24 without a lot of change, it's likely we might see some reductions coming back in interest rates in Australia. But right now, I think for the next 3 quarters still to play in Australia, I don't think there's going to be a dramatic change. And it certainly doesn't matter what I think. That's the commentary I'm reading, is that from people who do know, there's probably not going to be a lot of change. Yeah.
Rob, I really want to say thank you for your commentary today. What I'm taking away is cautious optimism in the Australian oat and hay export market with a tone of stability.
I'd say that's very fair, JP. Like that is where I'm sitting. I certainly have solid hopes and solid confidence in the future of the industry. But do I think it's going to take a right turn upwards, into fly? I don't think that's a reality. But I do think solid, steady opportunity to build exists in Australia for sure.
This podcast is proudly presented by Feed Central. Stay tuned in for more episodes coming up.